All right, so for our final video, I just going to talk about Ortega's view of states themselves, nation states, and what states are, and then maybe move on to his view of life and what life is. These are the things that I think impressed me the most, because they, for me, were the most existential in a way.
Mm.
And what I guess impressed me was what the last, I don't know, fourth of the book was a continued argument for was that we have somehow misunderstood what a state is. So the theorists in his time assumed that a state was made of people who shared similar blood, or similar race, or similar language.
Language, yeah.
Or for example, natural boundaries that just happened to form a state in that place. And that's how states get formed. Just these like groupings of people come together, and then they form a nation state, and then history moves forward. Now he's trying to say that this is a completely backwards way of looking at states. And this is what really impressed me and moved me, because I had inklings as to this point, but he took it right to its extreme, which is that he said, you're looking at everything backwards. The reason why people have similar languages and blood and cultures and traditions is because the state made them. The state unified them. The state didn't start with people speaking similar languages. It started with some people dragging a bunch of people together and forcing them to speak a similar language. It started with even people of somewhat different racial groups, forcing them together into one space, and then kind of by forcing them together, they become a kind of homogenous group. Mm-hmm. This is an idea of statehood that's not static. A state for him is not a state. It's a continually dynamic procedure, and the core of a state is not this static, well, these people belong together. It's people ever trying to reach out and bring different groups of people together, bringing them under the same roof via economic links or anything else. But all the state does is gets bigger and bigger, not on similarities. What it does is it reaches out into differences. And the origin of a state is in differences. And I don't know, I mean, I like this because even if you think about Japan itself, Japan was a country made of 100 different little countries. I mean, Japan itself was a country of little bitty countries that they just forced together. Japanese is not, the standard Japanese is not Japanese. Japan had tons of dialects, but one day the Meiji emperor said, look, you're speaking this military speak now. Standard Japanese was forced on these 100 little countries. Right? This dynamic view of nation states, what's great about it is it spiritualizes statehood. Because he says states form, and they form not on blood, but in a spiritual principle. And the principle is living together, a forming of a community. It's not blood or race. It's something spiritual that anyone can join.
I like how he says this. He says calls it a plan of action, and the will to do something in common is what runs through the base of the states.
I don't know. What did you think of that?
After reading it, I have to say I was very impressed. I liked it quite a bit because you're right. I mean, just when you look at the history of it, it almost seems like these states were like warring and bringing in new peoples. Oh, some of these states anyway were warring and bringing in new peoples. I mean, they didn't care who they brought in as long as they brought them in and then dominated them and made them part of the group.
I mean, even the most homogenous places, like Germany, was a bunch of little bit of kingdoms and fiefdoms that united into one nation. The Roman Empire, I mean, oh my God, they were great at this. All they would do is just grab land and grab land. And they didn't care about religions. They didn't care about races. They just grabbed everyone in and threw them into one gigantic empire. And I think he sees the essence of statehood more there than not. And I don't know. He almost throws it back in these people's faces when these conservatives pop up and say, you know, it's nationalism, it's our race.
Yeah.
But he's saying they are the backwards ones. He says the people without a vision of the future, that's what they'll do. Any nation without a vision of its progress or the future will only look at what's similar about it, which is a dead end. For him, that is the dead end.
I like that. And that line, I think his line is perfect. He said, nationalism is a confusing of what merely consolidates and preserves with what urges on and constitutes. It's a great line. I like that a lot.
They've somehow missed the essence of what a nation is, right? They're stuck. They're dead ends. They're losers in the path of history, almost.
Yeah. And he suggests that as soon as like you lose this common vision, it will start slowing down and eventually start breaking up into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces until the state just evaporates. I love that quote. He's like, it either rises or falls. I think that's what he thinks of the state. It's either like an arrow. It's either rising or falling, and it's always in motion, always fluid.
I mean, now think of the world as it is today. And this is what I was kind of going to get at before, but the world in the world that Ortega is describing, what's happening is this: Europe is losing power, and the rest of the world knows it. This is after World War I. Europe has just suffered major, catastrophic losses that they couldn't possibly recover from in a short time, and they're just about to go through another war, maybe the most devastating war ever. Is just on the horizon, right? Nobody knows this at the time, but let's just say Europe's ship is sinking here, and everyone knows it. They're beginning to suspect it. Well, okay, that's the world now. Think of our world, though. What's happening now? Now the rumors isn't that Europe is sinking. The rumors are that America is sinking. The rumors are that we are losing power. And what's happening? Well, it's exactly what he said is happening in his time. Nationalism's rising up after our empire goes down. So the American empire fades, and what happens? A bunch of little countries flare up in these nationalistic prides, proclaiming that they are now the rulers of their own destiny, right, and that they can do whatever they want to, and they're consolidating. I find it interesting that our time mirrors this time a little bit. Didn't you think so?
Wow, I like that interpretation. I also, I think there is that kind of even within the states, a kind of revival of a certain type of maybe increasingly extreme conservatism. It's trying to get more and more and more.
I mean, the world is falling to the right. I mean, Europe is falling to the right. Japan is going to the right. Russia is falling to the right. Canada is even moving to the right.
It's interesting to think about, like, when Ortega says, like, after this expansion stops, it starts to disintegrate. I mean, even if you think about the tactics of like the right in the States, where suddenly it's not just Americans, it's true America, heartland America, versus those crazy liberals on the coast, right? It just gets smaller and smaller and smaller, right? So now we're not just Americans; we're divided between the true ones and the fake ones.
Right. It's like our vision of the world has been lost. Even within our own country, right? We don't share the same country, or at least we're losing our vision of the country, a shared country together. And don't you see how that's interesting, how that matches up with the balkanization of the world? Right? I mean, Scotland is going to be voting for independence soon from the UK, right? England itself can't keep itself together. Canada is always threatening to break up. It's almost as if there's the unifying principle, a vision of the world is being lost. Right? At least that's what Ortega, I think, was worried about. And I think that's what's happening now, or at least if Ortega were alive now, he'd be saying the exact same thing, only he'd be saying, after America goes away, who's going to take her mantle up? And, people are saying, well, China, or it's going to be a multi-power structure, but it does seem to mimic or kind of shadow what's going on now. I don't know. So I thought this was the most interesting and perhaps the most ominous aspect of this book.
Definitely.
All right, and so going off of that, as seeing nations or states not as a stable state, but as a project, a doing, a being, a gathering together of something that has to be done, not a state of nature, right? A nation-state doesn't start out because there's blood. It's not something you find out there. It's something that has to be forced together, right? That's what he's saying. Essentially, right? Nation-states are projects. They're done. Well, in the same way, I think he sees that life itself is like that. Life is something that's done. And that reason and goals and projects are those very things that tie us together, that overcome differences and give our life meaning.
Mm.
That's what life is, a done thing. It's not something that's just there for the plucking, right? It's not life. It's fruit to be plucked right off. It's a project that has to be done by you and only by you.
Yes.
I mean, I think you would say without those things, you feel empty and meaningless, and that's why you feel empty sometimes when you're not engaged in these projects.
I mean, this kind of ties back into our previous conversation where we talked about egoism. Right? I think he thinks that to have a project is to have some outward goal in common, and this is what leads you to progress. Right? It's not just my whim, my whim, my whim. There's no progress in that. There is no project in that. The meaningful activity happens in progress toward meaningful and unified activity happens in progress toward the completion of some outward project.
It almost seems like reason itself is a kind of a binding force. That was the same way it was in Plato too, right?
Yeah.
That if you speak the same rationale, you're able to come together and not use violence. But as he says, when reason starts breaking down, what does the mass do? They use violence. And then it's interesting in the end, if I just mention this, that he says that the mass people use lynching. And I don't know. I think that the modern world lynches people just as well. Internet lynching is an industry now. People love internet lynching. In Japan, they love to lynch people on Twitter. But hate is an industry now. Like that, there's songs about hate, and Rebecca Black and Tayson Day. There's movies you're supposed to hate. That ABC bakery company person, you're supposed to just go in there and hate her, right? Even the Gordon Ramsay show, you're supposed to hate some of those people on that show. I mean, it's just this kind of large industry of lynching and hating on people you don't like. For example, the Rich Girls and The Simple Life, those reality TV shows, you're supposed to go on those shows and you're supposed to hate the people on those shows. I mean, you're supposed to use your violence and hate on them to get them to conform back to what they're supposed to be. I don't know. It feels like that matches very well with The Masked Man. Anyway, I don't think we have much time. Do we? Okay. So I don't know. That's almost all I have to really say, though. Any other final comments?
In general, I think I'm pretty good. His view of life is very interesting. It's even more fleshed out in the book. I highly recommend taking a look at the book, and it's kind of scattered throughout the whole thing. But if you piece together Ortega's view of life, it's
the stuff on concepts.
Yes,
I feel bad that we couldn't get to that. That was so good.
Yeah, I mean, this is where I think you were going with this reason as a project, and this is because I really liked what you said with that too. And I think I totally agree that his stuff on concepts is definitely worth taking a look at. So, other than that, I'm pretty good.
All right.
All right, that's it for this book. See you next time.
See you next week.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, we have a Twitter.
Yeah.
Check out.
Yes.
Yes, please talk about the Twitter.
Yeah.
Yes. We do have a Twitter account. Now that my work life is starting to slow down, I will get back to updating it. Please search for Tokyo Philosophical Society. We look forward to seeing you.